Welcome to the Building Design Primetime Podcast, focused on providing valuable information for anyone looking to undertake a new build or extension project. We'll share our tips, tricks and stories from a building designer's perspective.
Welcome to the Building Design Primetime Podcast. I'm your host, Amelia, and once again we're joined by Frank and we welcome back our guest, Clarence from Ionic Construction. If you've been following along from our previous episode, we talked to Clarence about condensation in your home. So we had part one in our previous episode. We're going to dive straight into part two. Enjoy, everyone.
But coming back to this thing with the decks over a habitable room, now if we take a sort of step sideways and look at a deck over a habitable room and look at the tiles on the deck.
So you have a bedroom underneath a deck which is fully exposed to the weather. Yes,
and there's nothing over the top of the deck. Now, how is that deck performing any differently to a roof?
It's not.
It's not. It's doing all the things that a roof are doing.
Exactly, it does everything.
So it's keeping the rain out, it's protecting the rooms underneath, etc., etc. Now, under the National Construction Code in Climate Zone 6, 7 and 8, so we're talking Blue Mountains, Canberra, Southern Highlands, lots of Victoria, southeast of South Australia, Adelaide Hills, southwest of Western Australia. So even though it's geographically not a huge part of Australia, there are millions of people living there and tens of thousands of houses are being built every year, big population centres of Australia. And so if you're in those areas and you have a roof which is less than 5 degrees, less than 10 degrees, there are certain things that must be complied with as far as roof ventilation is concerned. So if you build a roof that's 5, even 9 degrees, you must have a certain amount of ventilation clearance with your insulation, etc., underneath that roof decking. Now, how is a tiled roof over a habitable room any different to a roof?
It's not.
It's not.
And you can't vent it because the floor system is usually too thin.
Well, you can vent it.
Not well.
What's the saying? It's this American cartoonist. Heaven on earth is technically possible, but the cost would be astronomical. And it's a bit like that. It's possible, but the cost would be astronomical. It is absolutely possible to do, but the cost and complexity would be astronomical. So here we are. This is effectively the fourth exemption under the National Construction Code as far as ventilation of a roof. If it looks like a roof and talks like a roof and quacks like a roof, it's a roof. And if we've got a tile deck over a habitable room, it's doing everything a roof's doing, but it doesn't require ventilation. Jesse Clark from Pro Climber said if you wanted to build the most condensation generating structure in a building, a tile deck over a habitable room is it.
100%.
But it does not require under the code ventilation.
So
but
who's the muppet that thought that was a good idea?
Well, it's
that whole committee, the ABCB, because there's very convoluted processes you've got to go through, and it's massive. And through the BDAA, we have representatives there amongst lots of other associations, HIA, master builders, everyone's represented. Yet it's got so much more complicated there with the amount of paperwork and the amount of documents they have to read, yet the results aren't there.
And coming back to the tile decks over habitable rooms, you can go to the National Construction Code or the standards and find all sorts of layups and designs and construction methodologies for all sorts of different things. But as far as I'm aware, a tile deck over a habitable room, there is not a prescriptive design detail for a tile deck over a habitable room in any Australian standard or National Construction Code. So then, is a tile deck over a habitable room technically an alternative solution? It may have been your colleague Dale Barnes from the Building Designs Association of Australia who brought that up, that may well be an alternative solution, but people are building them as if it's the same as building a trussed roof or a stud-framed wall or a slab-on-ground construction.
They're not understanding their risk when they design it. Sorry, we're going down a right rabbit hole here, but we refuse to do lightweight tile decks. That's why we said go concrete. But that doesn't always work either, because the thickness of your floor structure doesn't allow adequate space to not only construct this, hold it up, but also to vent. There's just not enough space to do it because you've got to put a fall on this thing to get the water away. So then they say, it all comes down to your design. Well, it also comes down to the client's requirements, and sometimes you just go flat out and says, we can't hand on heart, guarantee this is going to work. And if we can't do that, we can't design it.
Yeah, look, that's right. And look, there are sort of ways around it as far as hygrothermal modelling or finding some funky design.
Is that the woofy software?
That's the woofy software, which basically are models that the heat and moisture transfer through a given system. And so there are technically ways around it. But the risk is extreme in the tiled decks over habitable rooms. But the other thing that happens with that is once you've got the 465 for Australian standard for the waterproofing of wet areas, the number of times you will see decks designed without the step down, and we're talking a lightweight frame deck where there's not the adequate step down at the
lip
door entry. And
but that's a different standard again. With the wind-blown rain, you've got to have an upstand.
Correct. Yeah, and depending on the wind zone, it's 50, 70 or 100 mils. And look, it's a very unfortunate, but there was one particular builder in Launceston and good operator, and they had 2 decks and at least 5 bathrooms which had failed from their waterproofing. I looked at one of the bathrooms and one of the decks, and we did a few sums on the back of a bit of paper and worked out there was over $500,000 worth of failures there, and the tiler had left and gone to Queensland and changed his name, changed his business name, and one of the decks I looked at had water coming in, with a thermal camera, had water coming in 6 different isolated locations. So it's not just one particular area. And then you throw the condensation in there as well, a few poorly vented fans or so on in the rooms underneath, and you've got a complete, I think schmozzle's probably the word, and a very expensive one at that.
Unbelievably expensive. So with that in mind, also failures, huge cost to the industry.
Yep.
You know, poor design, poor thought process, poor execution. From a cost and constructive perspective, what do you think are the biggest challenges meeting the new ventilation requirements? We touched on the ventilation.
Yeah, I think flat roofs and the flat roof systems are going to be one of the biggest shake-ups in the design and construction. I think it's only because people haven't got their head around, they don't realise how big the shake-up's going to be. Now, I believe there's a table in the National Construction Code, and I apologise for not knowing the number. I think it's E1A2.
I think we'll forgive you on that one because you know
a lot of them.
Look, it's a verification method in the National Construction Code, and it's been a big thing in the New Zealand National Building Code.
Didn't they go through hell?
That's still evolving too. We believe that New Zealand's got it all sorted out. They're further ahead of us, but they've still got a fair way to go as well. Not a fair way to go, but it's not like they've got everything 100% bedded down either.
No, but they went through a lot of pain.
Oh, absolutely, and we're talking, I think $50 million or 50 billion, I beg your pardon, billion, put a few zeros on there. Yeah, that's right. Look, I think it's E1A2, and this table basically models all the risk associated, and it's to do with water ingress from outside, not condensation. It's to do with weatherproofing, and it talks about decks over habitable areas. It talks about complexity of the facade. It talks about how wide your eaves are, etc., etc.
How do you do your flashings? Quality flashings.
Well,
as well, because you do beautiful designs.
Yep.
Doesn't mean you can actually flash it well.
If we look historically at, say we look at a brick veneer building, for example, we would have had a head flashing over the lintel. There would have been a sill flashing in the wall underneath the sill bricks. The sill bricks would have had a slope on them with a drip edge at the bottom, typically, not always, but that's the sort of thing that would have happened. Yeah. And you look at a lot of rendered buildings these days, you won't see any weep holes. No. There will not be any weep holes. There will not be any sills with an overhang on them. And when we get whether it be a masonry or whether it be a lightweight foam construction, when those external moulds are put on, I've seen several of them where the moulds actually direct water back into the building. Then there are no weep holes, then there are no flashings, or there's nothing to get the water out. And there's a lot of problems. And if you look at buildings these days that are rendered, it is very unusual to see weep holes and control joints on them, and very unusual to see sills. And this is the vernacular sort of construction that evolved over significant periods of time where people worked out, well, we have weep holes and sill flashings because they do a job. They're not there for the fun of it, they do a job. And now that these essentials have, to a large degree, fallen out of favour.
But I don't understand it because it's still in the construction code.
Well, I'd suggest that anyone go around and look at whether it's a foam-clad building or whether it's a brick veneer or a double brick building, and if it's rendered, and there's not all of them, a disproportionate number that do not have weep holes on them.
Which
Disproportionate number.
And that, I can't help but think that comes down to partly of training, education, to different sub-trades as well.
Or maybe it's the building surveyors,
is it the builder as well?
And the builder.
So it's a combination of all these people that need to know their stuff.
Yep.
Are we not doing enough education, or people ignoring it, or don't understand as a professional what your risk is? There's a whole range of potential issues.
There's all of the above, and I don't think there's any sort of single silver bullet that solves it. But just a few weeks ago, I was on a job, and the guy who did the job 13 years ago was a multiple award-winning builder, and when he put the weatherboard cladding on for the flashing, he just chopped into the weather-resistive barrier, silver foil, which was standard at the time, and there was no flashings, and there was water coming in everywhere on the building, and all the cladding had to be pulled off, all the membranes had to be redone. And this gentleman, I believe, is now in the training space of builders, and it's a bit of a shame. But I remember when I was an apprentice, if you got your flashing wrong, the boss would be on your case and screaming at you and telling you to do it properly next time, or you'd get your backside kicked.
My very first home was a 100-plus-year-old Federation joint, and I remember renovating that and repainting and all that. And even back then, they had flashings over the top of the windows.
Yes.
Hardwood weatherboards that were like a dog's hind leg, gaps everywhere, Baltic pine timber architraves and windows, but there was a flashing at the top.
Yep.
It was the sills that failed and rotted out, but they had drip grooves and all the rest of it in there.
Yes.
But this is worrying where even our modern techniques, that people are missing it.
And look, sometimes it's really simple stuff. And for example, on this job, when I was speaking to a colleague of mine who's came through as a roofer, who's now a builder, and he says whenever he has a window flashing, he puts a 5-degree slope on the top. And I said, I put an 8-degree slope on the top, so if there's any movement, you've got that little bit of redundancy. He said, that's a great idea, Clarence. But these are some of the really, really simple things. So if when you're doing your flashings, which are typically out of colour bond now, instead of having a 90-degree bend on the top, you have a 110-degree bend on the top to help shed the water. It can sometimes be really simple stuff. It doesn't need to be a case of reinventing the wheel.
As mums and dads, that might be listening to this, you wouldn't know this, but you'd expect your tradesmen to know. And they're talking about fast-tracking apprenticeships. You remember the federal governments were talking about cash to tradie apprentices, fast-track him to become qualified. It takes time. I don't know what profession you do. Doesn't matter where it is. You do adequate amount of training. You then go, at an educational facility. You then train under someone, mentor, train, learn as an expert. Then you're still working under someone over a period of time until you prove competent. I can't help but think that the competency is bloody disappeared because no one's checking their stuff. And you're letting people loose, giving them a licence, and in some cases they've done a Cert 4, they've never held a hammer. They should be called project managers, not builders. And they are then building houses. There's so much to check for a building surveyor, they can't see anything because of the limited amount of inspections they have. So then you've got tradesmen go out that aren't what I call competent.
Oh, look, totally agree. And whether that's a plumber or a carpenter or a building designer, it's across the board. And I think mentoring and pathways are really important. And the last guy who worked for me wanted to go out on his own. I said, I'll sign off your papers to get your ticket, but on the proviso that if you ever have a question, you make sure you ring me up for the first couple of years, which he did. And
because I believe in Tasmania, we've got to be very clear, we have licensing as builders. And we have to put that all on our paperwork. And there's licensing rest in Australia too, but different. Victoria, I think, is very similar. But on that, if you get your licence for the first time, why wouldn't you have a provisional licence? Why wouldn't you have P-plates with a mentor?
Yes.
And this is no different for building design, for architecture. I don't care what it is. And then you have to then report your bank of work. Look at the quality. Someone, checks it, approves it. Someone who's suitably qualified, independent of that, not their best mate or their old boss. No offence.
Yep. No, totally.
It's then we've got to have a level of accountability.
Yep.
Because if you don't get picked up on certain things, you're going to continue. You think it's okay to not add a flashing or not continue the flashings far enough, waterproofing, accept this, you don't tape up things, you don't follow through, or just construction techniques. And at the end of the day, the consumer loses.
Oh, look, I think the consumer loses, but I also think the trades lose as well. And it's really interesting, having been involved with the training for several years now, I get to know a lot of builders, and because I mainly work in the remedial space, not in the new construction space, they don't see me as a competitor, so to speak, and so I get to see a lot of jobs, a lot of builders, a lot of what goes on. And I think the fascinating thing that's happened in the last few years, especially around this high performance house, and if you look at there's Future Builder, if you look at some of the Pro Climber stuff, if you look at and Proctor's doing a lot as well as far as the high performance buildings, I think that's given a lot of trades a bit of a sense of pride again that there wasn't for a long time. It said we can do something better, we can do something different, and it's not just about granite bench tops and stainless appliances. It's about making houses that really are something better, and not just look better, something that actually perform better, and we can actually put a number on that. We can actually say it's not a number, but there's some sort of quality that goes with that, as far as the construction, the airtightness, the insulation, the detailing that goes with it. And I think that's been a real positive. But at the other end, as far as, let's call them the laggards, or the people who aren't at the upper end of the industry, all these things you say about mentoring, provisional licences, I strongly agree with. And I know that when I got my licence, I probably wasn't ready. I don't think most people are, but you can go straight out and build $1 million house within your first year, and there's no way I'd recommend someone with their first year of with a builder's licence to do that, because there's a huge amount of risk involved, and once we start seeing some of these funky designs, that risk increases significantly.
Massively, because of different materials you use, the different ways, and when you're spending good amount of money in building, it ain't a standard build. It's a custom build as opposed to being stock type of build.
Yes.
And if you can't get your stock builds right, what hope have you got doing a custom build?
Yes. When you talk about all the things like deemed to satisfy and alternative solutions, the further you go down that path, the more risk there is for these things to happen. And coming back to the condensation and energy efficiency side of things, I think in Tasmania we're sort of well ahead of the game, but in the other states they're not necessarily. This nexus between condensation or energy efficiency and condensation, there's this very hidden risk associated with it. And so historically, as builders and designers, we can see if that lintel over that window is too small, or the slope on the roof isn't sufficient, or there's not enough reo in the slab. They're things we can look at, and straight away they jump out at us as saying, well, that doesn't look right. But when we're talking about energy efficiency and condensation, we don't have the history in Australia to look at a job and automatically go, I see a risk associated with that.
Yes, I agree.
Because it's not a physical thing we can relate to, and I think the industry is changing. It's fascinating to be a part of it.
What I think is messing up a lot of the mindset is this stupid terminology about affordable housing. What a crock of rubbish! But this political use of these words bouncing around. Sorry, it costs what it costs. If you want a quality building, it's going to cost you. You can blame whoever you like what it is, but we build some of the biggest houses in the world. We discussed this previously. We've got to scale back what the expectations are on the size and what you want in these homes.
Look, I couldn't agree more. And the interesting thing is, historically, let's say the bank says, okay, a house of 200 square metres in suburb X is worth $800,000 for argument's sake.
Yes.
And you can build a house which is a super performance house that costs $800,000, but it's only 130 square metres because you're more interested in the performance. But is then the bank going to come along and say, wait a sec, $800,000 for a house that's only 130 square metres, something doesn't add up. And when we add into that the inherent cost of construction, let alone adding on all the high performance aspects, we've got a real crunch in Australia. And the last time I looked, I think it's since pre-COVID, the average cost of housing averaged out over Australia has increased 40% in 5 years. So you add that to all these other things, and it's a bit of a straw that breaks a camel's back. And I do believe in the next few years there has to be a major rethink about what you said about affordability, about what we are putting value on. Is it just the square metre of the building, Or is it something more than just the square metres of the building? Is it? Do we put a metric in there that says an 8-star, well-built, high-performance, healthy home at 130 square metres is worth as much as a 200 square metre home that's built like a cardboard box?
But to be fair, people can't see the value in it. Certain people. I should say certain people can't see the value in it until you live in one. Because they want to look at like the kitchen bench, the floor coverings, the special features, the bathrooms. People love that.
Yes.
And they're drawn to this beauty. It's no different buying a beautiful looking car, yet it's a shit box.
Yeah, but it's maybe like the Lexus mentality that sort of, it doesn't look like a BMW, but the Lexus people know it's a Lexus and they're happy having the Lexus. I don't know, is that a thing?
I don't know.
But I heard a thing once that Lexus people are the people who would own the BMW but are happy to have a messy house or something to that effect. But anyway, I don't drive a Lexus, don't know anybody who does. But
Frank does.
Frank does, there you go. Maybe I stuck my foot in my mouth.
Not at all. I got it for the quality and the reliability.
Have you got a messy house? I'm not going to go into your house and have a look.
I bet not something Veronica will kill me.
But I do think that turn is happening, and you look at Luke Davies and his business and what they're achieving there. And look, there are lots of others. You look at Ionic Constructions in Melbourne, and look, I can't think of any outside of Tassie off the top of my head, but there are several, Evan Graham in New South Wales, where they're pitching that to clients, and clients are saying, yes, I want this, in the same way historically they would have had the granite bench tops or the floor-to-ceiling tiles or the media room or whatever. And I think on one point you can say, yes, we've got distance to go on that front, but I also think there's been a huge amount of traction in that area. And if you go online, and just last night I was looking at Matthew Carlin Construction, who's got a lot of stuff on the internet, on Facebook and Instagram, and you can see that there's a pride in there, there's a quality in there, there's something above and beyond, we're just going to build the biggest box we can. And I think that the social media it's a bit of a double-edged sword, but that's definitely getting traction as far as the quality of construction. And interestingly, when we talk about trade skills and so on, and also the cost of failures, if we go to some of these online things, there's Zeher Khalil from Site Inspections, and there's a lot of, Luke Davies does a bit, there are a lot of people putting good information out there to show you how it can stuff up catastrophically, but also details on how to do things properly, which I think is really good. And
it's wonderful. I love that, because it points out where people shouldn't be builders. There's a clear indication there are people that aren't competent to be builders.
Oh, yes, and it's interesting, and David Chandler in New South Wales has mentioned this, and I saw one of the site inspections videos last week, and one of the rules of thumb is that if the site's messy and the site toilet's horrible and disgusting, you can tell that everything else flows from there. And I think on average that's a pretty good indication. Okay, my sites get messy from time to time, but keeping them safe and neat and tidy and organised means it probably flows onto other parts of the job as well. But look, coming back to the online and social media, I think there's a lot of resource there. And just last night I was looking at a roofer from Melbourne, and I was getting very, very excited about the amazing roofing work he's doing. And I learned a thing or two about sumps and rain heads. And look, it's interesting because people would say, oh, Clarence is a bit of an expert in this, that and the other, but I'm learning stuff every day.
Yeah,
and I think the fascinating thing about the building and construction industry, no matter what aspect of it you're in, there is always something to learn. And I think for young people, they say, oh, I'm just going to go and put nails into bits of wood, boring. But the amount of opportunity and knowledge and ability to do something positive for the world and for your community and for your clients it's pretty special. And I think that's a pretty unique industry for us to be in. And I think we can see this stuff around condensation building technology, building performance as a bit of is that another hoop we've got to jump through? But you can to some degree flip that and say we can make something a bit positive and special and interesting out of this, which is great. It has
exactly. Look, and I think it's a privilege when we get to design or alter someone's house, or even for their business. I love doing commercial work as well, and it's a real privilege, especially when you see commercial as a classic. And I don't know if people look at it this way, but you can design something with them, you listen to them intently, and their business explodes because of what you've helped them to design, and it functions well, and their business increases massively. No different with a house where you can meet their needs, their budget, and achieves everything they want, and the house is reliable for 50, 100 years. And I keep going back on reliability because I think everything we should do should last. Next owner may have different requirements, that's fine, but everything we should do, and we've got to stop looking at this minimum standard in the NCC and all the Australian standards. Minimum isn't a target. We should be going above this to ensure that you get the quality of the construction, pride in what we do, and then if everyone follows that type of lead, we'll have so many less problems. You know, there's some wonderful trades, sub-trades that do amazing work that never get recognised, and it's always... It's the guys that don't do the right thing and says, hey, I've got an excavator, I can go dig house footings, I can do plumbing, I can do this and all sorts of stuff. Give the rest of the industry a bad name. If you're passionate about what you do and you want to be the best excavator driver, the best tiler, the best roof plumber, whatever, be that, learn, listen, and you will always have work. You have this wonderful reputation. I love doing this to my kids. My kids got sick of this when they were younger. I designed that house. I designed that building. And they got sick of this, trust me. But I take a great deal of pride in that. Well, my team did this. You know?
And the other thing too, from a sustainability point of view, the built environment, it uses a ton of resources.
Huge.
The waste stream alone from construction, whether that's renovation or things going wrong, is phenomenal. So getting it right.
That's a whole other topic.
That's right, and we can talk about embodied energy and carbon and sustainability, etc. But building crap houses or doing a crap job on houses is one of the most unsustainable things you can possibly do. And when they're going to be there for 50, 70, 100 years and we're building crap buildings that that don't last, that's about the least sustainable thing we can be doing. And look, and this is not a plug for you, Frank, but it was interesting because I think it was 2 years ago, you were the head of the BDAA, Danita Warren, who's from Tassie, was head of Master Builders Australia. Now, what's his name? Stuart Tanner from Tassie, he was the head of the Australian Institute of Architects, and there was another one, and I think we had 4 Tasmanians at the peak of industry bodies in Australia, and I know most of those people, I don't know Danita, but Craig Edmonds from Master Builders is now the chairman of Master Builders Australia, and to think that in Tasmania, 2% of the population, we had people in these peak bodies really driving very positive stuff for the industry. I think that was a pretty special time for Tassie in the construction industry, and people don't recognise that. And for 2% of the Australian population to be doing that, it shows that we can punch above our weight. And I'd like to think that doing these podcasts like this, the work that Mark Dewsbury's doing, the stuff that Luke Davies is doing, I think Tasmania has a really interesting place in the industry, and there's this thing called the Wagga Wagga effect, and it basically says there's a disproportionate number of sports people that come from Wagga Wagga because of its position in the regional area of Australia, and I would argue that there's a bit of a Tasmania effect where we can sort of do our own thing and use that as a bit of a testing ground where things can then develop in other parts of Australia. So maybe with us collectively, there's a lot that can be done in Tassie to sort of get the foothold for the next level in the rest of Australia. And I see what's happening on multiple levels, and I think it's pretty special. And when there's a bit of doom and gloom and focus on the problems, it's an interesting sort of bright light in the construction industry in Australia. Yeah,
wow. That's very cool. I actually didn't realise that, to be honest with you, that was the case. So,
yeah, we're at the forefront.
Yeah, well...
That's kind of cool to think of that.
We have a very unique industry in Tasmania too, because we only bang out, 3,000 odd houses a year, sometimes less. In the peak, I think it was about 5,000 in, I think it was 16, something like that. I saw the stats just recently. We don't build a huge amount of houses compared to the rest of the country. And none of our houses are cookie cutter, and that's another unique thing. So we do have to think creatively on a lot of our stuff. It's nice that not all our stuff is the same, but then comes that complex problem of making sure that it performs over a long period of time.
It's interesting when you talk about cookie cutter, I'm not suggesting company A, B or C is cookie cutter or not, but there was a volume builder on the mainland, and coming back to this, I suppose this is a good tie-up of a lot of the things we've been talking about, and as I've said before, that the ventilation in buildings, in my opinion, is going to be the next massive challenge for the industry.
I totally agree.
And for the Building Codes Board to get their head around from a regulatory point of view. There was a builder, a volume builder in Melbourne, I believe, one of the big volume builders, and they were having a huge amount of problems with air quality, mould, occupant health, etc. And they, as far as I'm aware, put a fairly basic heat recovery ventilation system into all their new builds as a standard. So I suppose that even at that, let's call it mass production or estate or spec home, whatever you want to call it, end of the market, that even there it's been recognised that this is an important thing, and they've managed to factor that into their builds, and that's part of it. And with any of these things, you would hope that as things become more common, that the skill set increases, the knowledge increases, the desire for other segments of the industry to take that up increases, and as a result, hopefully, costs come down. But as you said before, it's not all about would you rather live in a big crap house or a small, nice,
quality
healthy house?
Quality
house that's going to last.
That's it.
For your kids and then some.
Yeah, and I think that's the other side of it too as we go forward, for your kids. I think that's a very interesting point. With affordability and the rest of it, kids are going to be hanging around home. It's just the way it is. And you look at all different countries around the world, they've all gone through some type of, this level where home ownership probably never even existed in some cases. We've been very fortunate in Australia. Things are changing. We've got to work our way through that. And I think our generations are going to be able to have to help our kids, or you make good decisions of what you buy as call it an asset, call it a home, whatever you like, that is going to last. And your kids may have to move in there.
And look, it's interesting, and I'm sort of aware that I'm seen as the sort of a bit of a go-to person. God help the world if I'm a go-to person. But anyway, I do know a thing or two about the condensation and mould. And this was an interesting thing that happened during COVID, is when everybody was working from home and the kids weren't at school, and there was a disproportionate amount of problems with health, mould, condensation. And again, once we start getting to more people within a given floor area, that's another consideration. And the simple analogy I like to use about that is, if you think of a swimming pool with 5 people in it versus a swimming pool with 50 people in it, well, the swimming pool with 50 people is going to need a lot more filtration to keep it clean.
And chemicals and all the rest of that.
And what happens in a house, we have more people within a certain area. So the problems as far as bacteria, air quality, health are going to increase. So this is all part of the conversation, and as we're going down this path towards smaller houses, high performance houses, more airtight houses, these things, ventilation, the air quality, have to be central to the whole conversation, whereas now I would say 98% of people probably know it's out there somewhere but don't have much of an understanding of it.
And that's it. And this is where we want to try and educate people, where there's simple things to do. Open your damn windows, people. Change the air. Or install a heat recovery ventilation system. Not saying these are all silver bullets, but you've got to learn to operate your house. No different, you have to maintain your house. You've got to maintain your car. You've got to learn how to operate a house.
I also think that over time, particularly in the cooler climates, an integrated approach to air quality inside the building, and as you said, it's not just about putting a heat pump, air conditioner on the wall, it's going to be a more considered approach. And again, if we look at it from an affordable housing point of view, if you've got a cheap house and your kids are always sick with asthma or there's mould everywhere, well, what's the real cost of that going to be?
Exactly right. You don't realise it because it sneaks up. You can't see it. It's hard to measure. And I think this is half the things. We can't measure it. We can't see it. Like the CO2 meter was a golden idea if we, takeaways. I think that's absolutely fantastic. But opening your windows, getting airflow, think about, don't dry your clothes inside.
And look at
your dryer.
And look at an interesting thing too, and this is where the technology can really be a huge boon for us. And I remember years ago when we had problems with air quality, mould, humidity, etc., you'd have to go back and put a humidity meter in and measure it and go back and back and back and measure again and measure again. And now it's possible to get these humidity sensors, air quality sensors, which can be just hooked up to your phone or your internet. They're $200, $300, $400 each. I've got
Really?
10 of them sitting in buildings all over Launceston. I can tell what's happening in the roof, in the floor, etc., etc. And this coming back more, I suppose, towards designers rather than homeowners. But there are several builders out there now who are actually, if there's, let's say you're designing a building and you're a bit unsure about how it's performing or what's happening in the cavity or whether there's going to be a mould risk, you can actually build one of these meters and put them in the roof cavity, put them up against the battens, put 2 or 3 in the building. Okay, it costs you $700, put them in there. You can monitor that for the next 3 years till the batteries run out, and you can say, okay, well, I know that house is healthy.
Yeah.
The humidity is within the safe range, or you can say, okay, I know there's a problem and I've got to go back and fix it. But then that also becomes something you can on-sell to your client by saying, we've actually got monitors in your building that we can monitor for the first 2 or 3 years.
That's
so
wild.
we actually
That's
know.
Totally wild. Yeah.
We actually, and look, for $700, what do you get? You get a couple of PowerPoints put in, you know, get a crappy shower screen.
Considering you might be dropping anywhere to $400,000 to $700,000 on a basic home.
That's right. And so you can put these things in there. And so it's a really simple way, if you've got a complicated or a high-risk design, to actually get some metrics on there where there are these grey areas. Now, I was speaking to someone on the mainland, and I can't say too much, but it was a $4 million build. $4 million build.
Wow.
Okay, $4 million. And in the first winter, they had, it was absolutely ringing wet inside the roof space. And I'm thinking, if you've got a $4 million build with the ringing wet inside the roof space...
eventually that's going to turn into a dudegrade mouldy mess.
Well,
you've got
that's
mouldy
right.
bread.
Yeah, and
look on your trusses everywhere.
And this is obviously for a very high-end client, and these things are happening everywhere, and this is in obviously a high
I've seen here locally.
Yep. And the cost of these is significant, and we talked a bit about this before as far as training is concerned. The federal government wants zero carbon, net zero, high energy efficient homes, and as soon as we say Paris Accord, energy efficiency, I'm not making a political judgment on that, but transport's got to do a bit, agriculture's got to do a bit, manufacturing's got to do a bit, construction's got to do a bit.
Everyone.
And that means that higher energy efficient homes, and as we know, high energy efficiency means, on average, compromised in air quality, condensation, mould and interior health. It's just a given. That's every developed country around the world has found that's happened over the last 50 years. Building physics works the same whether you're in Australia or America or Africa. And I believe that even just from the public health point of view, the government needs to be putting money into training to avoid these knock-on effects of houses that fail, poor health, poor air quality, etc. Because the costs are in the billions. It's not. It's a very
That's
significant
right.
amount.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Well, we might start wrapping up because we have been chatting for over an hour now.
Really?
We have, yes. So I guess
Have we set a new record?
no, not quite. No, I think Toby's probably still is the longest one we've done.
Got to give him a shot at the record.
Oh, look, and I think the other thing too, it's a very interesting topic, and as Frank and I alluded to before, that the industry is fascinating, ever-changing, and for any young people out there or people who are interested in a career change, there's so many opportunities in the construction industry, and it's a
From every
fascinating
level too.
place, absolutely.
From highly technical to, all these different levels down to the most basic level, but it's all valuable. It doesn't matter what position you are in the buildings, from labourer, excavator, truck, tiler, bricky, cladder, chippy, roofer, plumber, whatever. All very valuable part of the whole process.
And we need to build more houses desperately.
And
desperately.
do
We
it, do it well.
Absolutely.
Got to do it well.
Yep.
So we might wrap up with, are there any resources available for people that want to learn more about condensation?
Look, I think that the single biggest resource that I find is LinkedIn. And look, that's just the one I happen to use, but there are lots of other good resources out there. My suggestion would be and look, it's only just since you've asked me to do this podcast, I've looked at the whole world of podcasts. I think, oh my goodness, there's a colleague of mine who did a podcast with a guy called Jay Stuybrick, who's the godfather of building science in the world, and so there's a huge amount of resources out there. Go to the podcasts, the Prime Design ones. Jess Kismet does one called the Building Sciology Poddy, SCIOLOGY Poddy, and there are a whole lot of other resources out there on LinkedIn, and companies like like Prime Design and others, and Building Designers Association, etc. There's training, there's resource. So get online and just find out what you can. And the other thing too is, because there are so many experts out there, if you have a question, put it out there on one of the forums, and particularly in LinkedIn, and more often than not, you'll find there are people who actively want to share that information with you.
And so you're available on LinkedIn if somebody wanted to ask you a question?
Yep. And if I can't answer the question, there's a huge, let's call them a brains trust out there, who's 9 times out of 10 very willing to help out people. And it's a fascinating area, so jump on, shoot us a few emails, or put a post up, or respond to one of the threads that's there. And Mark Dewsbury and I are trying to get more resources out there, but as we all know, there's a lot of work to do that well.
Yeah, totally. Well, thank you very much for the effort
Yes,
you put into the
thank
industry,
you.
mate.
No.
Really appreciate you coming on here, and we're hoping to get Mark on here as well, and so we can spread the education.
Yeah, and look, I'll twist his arm, and look, having Mark Dewsbury, who's just up the road here, literally the passion and knowledge he's got for this is extraordinary.
It is, isn't it?
And I think that's why Tasmania is where it is. So I'll twist his arm and make sure he gets in here. I call myself Mark Dewsbury's Minister for Propaganda. He's too busy. He's too busy doing his research to say, Mark, you've got to put more of this information out there. He says, yes, Clarence, we will. So, very good. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate you inviting me and having these conversations, because I think it helps lift everybody up. And thanks, Amelia, and thanks, Frank.
We might wrap up part 2 there. Thank you so much, Clarence, for coming in and having a chat to us about condensation. It's such a huge topic of conversation in our industry at the moment. So thank you so much for coming in and having a chat to us about it. And hopefully our listeners out there have got some value on how it can affect their home and what things they can implement. So thank you so much for that. We might wrap it up there. Thanks for listening to the Building Design Primetime Podcast. We'll catch you next time.
Catch us later.
You're listening to the Building Design Primetime Podcast.